Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Safe Space for White Questions, the August 2023 edition. I'm Alex Khasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Saint Vincent University, and I'm one of the two co-hosts of this show. My partner in crime, Ajay Parasram, is on the call as well as always. I'm going to throw it over to him in just a second to do his intro, but I just want to welcome everyone here. If this is your first time, welcome. If this is a return visit, welcome back. This is, of course, Safe Space for White Questions, where we answer your questions about racism, social justice, anti-racist activism, and related things. And just before we get going, of course, I want to, as always, acknowledge that this broadcast is coming to you from Kijipuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, that's unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory in what is known as Halifax, Nova Scotia by its colonial name these days. And I, of course, want to thank our very wonderful friends at Fernwood Publishing for doing so much of the bottom lining on this show, from advertising to the tech work to making sure that you folks know about us to begin with. So without any further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Ajay so he can say a couple words about himself, and then we get to your question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ajay Parasram. I also sell my labor at a university here in Chibuktuk, a different one, Dalhousie University, in international development studies and history. Perhaps more interestingly, I'll be speaking on a related theme to the work that we do here on Safe Space for White Questions this weekend in Chibuktuk at the Anarchist Book Fair. So if you are watching from the East Coast, come check out the Anarchist Book Fair this weekend. It's going to be great. Yeah, I mean, I think let's just jump right into your questions.
All right, sounds good. So folks, if this is your first time here, I'll be a bit pedantic about it. Just remind you of how this works. Questions can come into us during the show, of course, but you're also welcome to submit in advance via our Google form. So we do have some questions that have been submitted in advance, and you're going to get right to them. AJ and I are going to take turns going back and forth on these. And then we have some questions left over from previous months which we should get to. Anyway, let's get to the first one. Okay, first question. Is it useful to parse out religion versus race? Case like Jews as people, as a group, and Judaism as a religion, or being Indian and being Hindi, though the latter doesn't have as strong association as Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, etc. Okay, so good question. So at the core here, is it useful to parse out religion versus race? I mean, like, really just straightforward. I would say yes, absolutely. The Jewish question, to frame it that way, is a great example of where people see it getting thorny, precisely because Jews are regarded both as a racial group and as a religious group. Of course, you could also argue it's obviously also a nationality in the case of the state of Israel. And there's a lot of overlap there. It's not always so clear, right? I mean, most people would not assume that Christians are all white necessarily, of course, or all come from the same racialized background. So as you're pointing out in your question here, yeah, with regard to other so-called world religions, this gets a lot stickier. Like, in many ways, this is, like the Jewish case, if I can put it, if not without trying to suggest that it's more important or unique in the history of Europe, for sure, anti-Semitism has extremely deep roots, and in some ways that really gets to, I think, what you're getting at in this question. This overlap between Judaism as kind of like an ethnic, cultural, racialized identity, and then, of course, all the religious, linguistic, cultural trappings around it. It's not always so clear, or so perhaps the reverse. It's not always so confusing with other groups, right? We all know Muslims who come from different ethnic or racialized backgrounds, Certainly, Halifax has a large Buddhist community that is not primarily South Asian or Asian at all. Lots of white folks here, and like any religion that calls itself a world religion, by definition, spread around the world, and included different people. So yeah, like straight up, simply, yes, it's super important to do. And in many ways, I think what your question is pointing to is just a theme that we keep coming back to on the show, which is the really slippery and in some ways really fraudulent notion of race. That race itself doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. When we start to scrape below the surface, we find we're actually talking about different forms of identification, either imposed or self-identified. We're never really talking about any kind of essential biological difference, obviously. It gets thorny sometimes because of the way it's used, because it's become such a common point of reference in our society that people use it so casually, but stop to ask people what they mean by race, and find that is one of the most difficult and slippery concepts that exists. So yeah, absolutely, do all the distinguishing you should. Keep those concepts separate in your mind. As difficult as that can be sometimes, obviously, our cultural practice informs our notions of racialized identity. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Not a whole lot to add there. I guess the piece I would say is, I agree with Alex. Yes, always useful to embrace specificity whenever possible, because if you're talking about a racialized group, it's not the same as talking about religion, for all the reasons that Alex said. What I would add, though, is it's also important to remember that racialization is a process that happens to people and to groups and identifiable groups. So, and place and context matters quite a bit too. So the way in which, for example, Buddhists might be racialized in one particular context, Alex talked about, the predominantly white Buddhist population that we see here in Chibuktuk. That's one particular group, but then the way that someone might practice a Buddhist identity in, say, Sri Lanka, is going to be really different. And the meaning of being Buddhist and organized around Buddhism carries a particular ethnic and nationalistic characteristic in the context of Sri Lanka because of the details of the history there. So Buddhist supremacy is an issue in parts of South and Southeast Asia, in the same way that Hindu supremacy and caste supremacy, even within Hindus, culture, is a big issue in India and increasingly across the global diaspora. So, and caste, we've talked about caste a few times in the show. Caste is tricky because it jumps religious groupings as well. So it's not something that just stays within, broader Hinduism. Caste manifests across various South Asian identities, and it has, while it's not race, it's sort of race-like in terms of its consequences. So racialization happens in different places in different ways. To be racialized, for example, in Canada, I might be racialized, and I have been several times racialized as a Muslim in Canada for a variety of different reasons, not least of all, perhaps, my beard and my skin color. And the fact that I'm married to a Muslim, perhaps. I mean, there are lots of reasons that might add up. But in fact, I'm I'm an upper caste Hindu, and that comes with a lot of really distinct sort of obligations and positionality and privileges, as well as discrimination. Obviously, when somebody jumps me for an Islamophobic attack, which also happens, they don't care that I'm not a Muslim. This happens to, for example, in Canada, one of our federal party leaders, Jagmeet Singh, is a very visibly Sikh man who has been very often terrorized and harassed with Islamophobic violence, even though he's not a Muslim. It's not about that. So the lens of race and racism actually doesn't care at all about ethnic specificity and accuracy. So the way in which people are racialized in a particular society is a reflection of that society, and it's not going to happen in the same way. You're not going to be racialized, in South Asia in the same way as you might be in Canada or the United States. So that's the only thing I would add to that. Thanks for the question. An important issue to talk about for sure. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for that, AJ. All right, moving right along to question number 2, which is a bit of a longer one, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here. The question is about both defunding the police and about the slogan ACAB, ACAB, famously meaning all cops are bastards. So the person here is asking about, so they've seen the term, the acronym ACAB. They've seen it in movement spaces recently. They're asking about its connection or lack thereof to defund the police as a broader movement. And then the core of the question is this: is there a happy middle? Happy being a vague term, but in general, going for ACAB or going for Blue Lives Matter seem to be two extremes. So the person is asking if we can find sort of, is there a happy middle to occupy between the kind of explicit attempt to do away with the police as an institution, perhaps even more pointedly in the very famous anarchist slogan, ACAB, all cops being bastards, which is more personal and more, like militant revolutionary propaganda. And of course, on the other hand, we have like, the kind of celebration or sanctification of police in the whole Blue Lives Matter campaign. So, yeah, this person's just asking, what about a slogan like too many police, too little justice is another slogan that seems to be a more serious alternative than not fond of the police, right? Or ACAB. So good question. I mean, we get this, we get questions like these a lot. And I mean, I think on like my take on this is pretty straightforward. Like we're just distinguishing here between revolutionary sloganeering and propaganda, which all movements engage in, and the serious work of rebuilding a society, right? So ACAB definitely precedes efforts to defund the police. ACAB is an old punk anarchist slogan, comes out of like working class communities and communities of color primarily, comes out of like a broad-based anarchist tradition that sees the state as an enemy of social justice and sees police as the frontline agents of repression of that system. So it doesn't like, if this makes you feel any better, it doesn't literally mean I don't think that any anarchist is seriously saying that each and every single police officer is a bastard. But it certainly represents that kind of revolutionary antipathy to dominant institutions, right? Like it's like talking about school as a prison, right? I mean, most of us would acknowledge that that's like a pretty facile and simplistic equivalence to make, but lots of people argue it precisely because it brings out, it kind of like highlights the contrast, right? It increases the contrast when we're thinking about what these dominant institutions do. It's like Marx's famous line about religion being an opiate of the masses, right? Does that really mean that's all religion is? Is that what Marx thought all religion was? No, of course not. But certainly speaking to the kind of function of these institutions in society. Is it an effective slogan to woo members of the middle class and the professional managerial class and, like upstanding white folks and all this sort of stuff to a movement to reform the police? Probably not. But, like, again, I would ask you, is that really the object of all revolutionary sloganeering, right? It's one prong in it, and you don't have to like it. There are lots of contexts. I think it's not useful or productive. Obviously, if we were in a policy setting, like in a policy meeting with city officials, and you're there as a representative of the community, and you're shouting ACAB the whole time, yeah, that's not going to resonate, and you're not going to change anybody's mind. But if you're in a march, and some racialized person has just been gunned down in what looks like an extrajudicial killing on the street by police officers, and the community is super mad and there's a lot of grief and rage and people are shouting that, well, like, I think that's probably a bad idea for you to step forward and say, excuse me, let's remember that not all cops, right?
So, like you're absolutely right. Like, let's hold the tension in our minds, right? And understand that there are movements and moments for the utterance, the use of certain kinds of revolutionary sloganeering. On the other hand, like I would say, I have to be honest, and I would push back against the Blue Lives Matter thing. And the Blue Lives Matter is what, sort of in social movement studies, we would call a classical example of astroturfing. So what is astroturfing? Astroturfing is when powerful interests basically seed the ground for a movement to come together and really fund it and organize it and create it, bring it into being through their resources, often through their professional contacts or their pull, their power in society, rather than a movement emerging organically from the grassroots, right? So movement like defund is pretty organic, right? And we can quibble with aspects of that, but you're looking at movements or at organizations, at people in struggle across like a huge variety of contexts who are raising common concerns about the institution called the police and looking for alternatives to the violence that institution propagates and produces in society. On the other hand, you have a bunch of really well-resourced police unions, which think about the aristocracy of labor. These are the most cops make over 100,000 in Canada, right? Like that is not working class. That is like significantly above that kind of pay grade. And their unions similarly, like lots of professional unions, like doctors, like professors in many cases, like others of us who are like, elevated by virtue of status and income in society. Those police unions have lots of resources. And yeah, like I don't begrudge it that they're pushing back against an effort to defund them and the institutions they represent. But Blue Lives Matter comes from that, right? Like that's why they have like those goofy wristbands and like the patches and stuff, right? Like that's not coming from your grandma making that on her sewing machine at home. That's coming from, like some sweatshop factory overseas probably that can hand it out and push back. And again, that's politics. That's fine. That's how these things work. But don't like the equivalence, I think, is a problem there, right? To suggest that they're just two different positions in society. Just to finish before I pass it over to AJ, because I think we could obviously, as this demonstrates, we could say a lot about this. I think it's like important to keep in your mind that when we're talking about the police, we're talking about the police as an institution, not as individual people. So I know lots of cops who are wonderful people. And I wish them like not the least bit of ill. I do wish that, that the institution worked radically differently in our society. I'm not going to get into my own personal vision right here. Obviously, that's not what you want to hear, and we don't have time for that. But I would just say, yeah, like I get it. But don't like, this is one of those questions. If you're like not up against the cutting edges, if you've never been stopped in your car because of the way you look, if you've never been random, ID checked on the street, if you don't get followed around in stores just because of the color of your skin, then like don't police other people. Sorry to use the word police again. In terms of like how they feel about those institutions that have like loomed really large over their lives. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I guess how to start this one. So the first thing I would say, it's obviously something we get a lot. We actually take up the issue a bit in our book, frequently asked white questions. So I had the privilege of reviewing what we wrote about that while Alex was talking. And I think I'll start just by reading a little bit. It's a quote by Omali Yeshitela, who's the chairman of the US-based African People's Socialist Party and a prominent leader in the Uhuru, which means freedom in Swahili movement. And he explains it in this way. I'm just going to not paraphrase, but jump to the part that's relevant to the police. He says, and of course, people think that you've got to have the police, because if there were no police, look at what you'd be doing to yourselves. You'd be killing each other if there were no police. But the reality is the police become necessary in human society only at that junction in human society when there's a split between those who have and those who ain't got. And I think that remembering the history of policing is actually a really important way to approach this question and to understand on a historical and contemporary basis why it's actually quite harmful and violent to present Blue Lives Matter or the thin blue line as anything that might resemble an equivalent with Black Lives Matter. So yeah, basically, policing is something that we assume for a variety of reasons, media, etc., has always been with us with society. But it really did emerge at a historical time when the gap between the rich and the poor got really, really big. And it wasn't incidental. And police were not always like a highly paid, professionalized kind of force. They were always sort of like mercenaries. They were sort of the people who would enforce the will of the feudal lords and that sort of thing. But they become an institution, I think, especially in settler societies, where they're trying to protect the property interest and wealth interests of the elite of society away from the norm. Because when there isn't a huge gap between the rich and the poor, nobody really wants to steal your stuff. And I think that this is where, and Foucault talks about this a lot, about how the institution of prisons, like many other institutions, it pathologizes people and it gives rise to the carceral state, and kind of fulfills its own identity. Like when you think about it, looking at the United States and Canada, sure, you started with genocide and then you went to slavery, chattel slavery. And then after chattel slavery, you basically create a prison industrial complex where, again, you store people who you fear are going to disrupt the social norms, without ever trying to address the kind of long-term issue. Does that the fault or account or responsibility of any single police officer? Of course not. But in the same sense that when people talk about race as a structural and historical condition, it doesn't say anything about an individual white person, but it does reflect on the power of structural white supremacy. And so to say something, to present as the police do, this idea of the thin blue line, or to say Blue Lives Matter in a way that so obviously is meant to territorialize, for lack of a better word, the initials BLM, that is to me a really callous, hollow, and perhaps I don't even want to say thoughtless move, because it's actually very thoughtful. It's an attempt to discredit what has proven to be a very powerful catalyzing force to get people to pay attention to the systematic disregard for Black lives in and across global society. It is an invitation to remind us to think about anti-Black racism as an organizing structure of the modern world. So when police, whether ignorantly or not, say, well, Blue Lives Matter too, what they're saying is that their job is hard. But the job isn't hard because of, whatever skin color it is they have. It's true, like police are, asked to put their lives on the line in a similar way that soldiers are asked to put their lives on the line. But it is a job. It's a job that you can leave in a way that you will never leave your Black skin, if you have Black skin. And it's not the same. And I think moreover, what makes it even worse is it is a deliberate attempt to, when the attention is finally being paid on the issue of structural anti-Black racism, to say, actually pay attention to us because we're the real victims here. And if you think that the police are the real victims, I would invite those police officers to go and find another job. It gives rise to this idea that, a family member of mine, who I won't name, who is a police officer, talks about the manifestation of blue fragility, as something. So it's more akin, I think, to white fragility when we think about the response around police officers, the glorification of carceral culture in our society. Like, I've got a 4.5-year-old kid who is, always exposed to Paw Patrol as some kind of like innocent thing, where you have these like militarized animals going around punishing people and throwing them in jail as if that is at all a logical way to conduct yourself in a society of equals. So it gives rise to all kinds of issues, including like the large body of issue on abolition. But like Alex said, we could talk for hours about it. We do talk about it in the book to some extent, and there are lots of other wonderful books that talk about this at length. For example, L. Jones's work, Ardith Wynott's work, both Fernwood authors as well. And I would invite you to kind of pursue some of those sources in the reading list that we have attached to the YouTube channel here. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, great response, AJ. I guess I just want to throw something in there too, just as you were talking, it made me think of it as well. It's really like one thing that I think we talk about a lot on the show, but we also talk kind of around it a lot, is this notion of kind of respectability politics, right? Like that, this notion that's really like deeply entrenched in our society and many others. And you can understand why. We have like a million historical points of reference for this, that like the only way sort of decent people make change are through like civilized and civil channels, right? So, why are you making trouble when you could, like lodge a complaint? Why are you using slogans like this, or blocking streets, or disrupting people when you could go to town hall meetings and all that kind of stuff? And like, I think in a society that is so awash in ruling class mythologies, and by that, like, I mean the propaganda that AJ's just talking about, right? Like, turn on the TV and like, like this is not at all to shit on the police, but to say like most cops are not like saving, people from human trafficking rings and like chasing down serial killers and like, like just in time intervening in somebody's, who had some awful plot to like blow something up or commit, that's not like most of us, right? If you're a mechanic, if you're a doctor, if you're a professor, if you're an accountant, if you're a nurse, if you're a dishwasher, like your days are not filled with like either these dramatic, overwhelming moments where, like everything is exciting and incredible and path-breaking. Like most of it's pretty mundane, right? We all know that in our individual lives and our individual work, but some of us really, because of the position played by the institutions in our society, like they are accorded a different standing, and they are enabled and lifted up by different kinds of mythologies. And the police are one of these institutions. It's sometimes true around things like hospitals and schools or religion, these institutions that are seen as pillars of our society, precisely because, they are the things that keep most of us in line while the ruling class lives off of our work and our wealth that we create. So, it's a much more difficult thing to get people to buy into if you said, well, this is basically a security force that protects private property. You have a lot less of it than I do. So yeah, just stay out of my way. That would like sort of generate a lot less social kind of like, support for institutions like the police. But that is, as AJ is pointing out, quite literally, without being cynical, the roots of policing in North America. And if you want to find out more about this, I think we've recommended it before, but it's a great little podcast series. It's called Behind the Police. It's like a mini series run by Robert Evans on his series Behind the Bastards, and I really recommend it. Goes into great detail in terms of the roots of policing, and just lays it bare, not as some malevolent conspiracy to destroy us all, but as very tied to the interests of people who had wealth and power. And so in a society that's like totally unequal like ours, and where the consequences of that inequality are not just you feeling bad about yourself or like having a crummy day, but literally your life being demonstrably shortened and the time you live here being much more difficult, violent, unhealthy, all those kinds of things. Like those are the consequences of inequality in our society. The people who defend those lines, their jobs aren't just neutral, so just like schools can't be considered neutral in an unequal society, right? Where the sorting function of education becomes about like actually determining to a large extent people's life outcomes. So I wouldn't just say this about the police, I'd say this about other institutions too. But just, yeah, really, really great, rich questions for sure. Just moving along here. Okay. We have a question from last month, actually we're not, this is an old one. Yes, we are going to come back to it. I think we took a very quick and dirty run at it in our last episode, but let's say I give it a fair hearing on this one. Is the war in Ukraine being taken more seriously because it is a traditional white European nation, The fast tracking of refugees to Canada because of that conflict is laudable. However, Afghans who have served Canada and allies for years are getting stuck in dangerous situations and not much movement seems to be happening. Good question. You know, I think the flippant answer I probably gave last time was yes. Certainly the whiteness of the victims of war in this case matters. You know, comparing it to conflicts elsewhere for sure. And this point's been made again and again by so many different folks, activists, scholars, policy folks, people involved in refugee work and NGO work, that, you know, like depending on the origin and skin color, and sometimes religious affiliation, all these things of people involved in conflict, like directly determines the kind of reception they're given. So like we go back to the 1980s and talk about Haitians fleeing Haiti and the desperate poverty, violence, disease that was gripping that nation at the time. And, you know, they were referred to all across North America, but especially in the United States, not as refugees, but as boat people, you know, as people who were like criminals, illegals looking to make their way into the United States. And at the time, they were directly blamed for bringing AIDS to the US, a fact which the very good epidemiological work of medical anthropologists and others was thoroughly debunked. And actually, like Haiti's AIDS crisis has been definitively linked to strains of HIV that actually originated in the United States and were brought to Haiti by American sex tourists. So like when you're thinking about like what the vectors of violence and inequality are, think about like, yeah, you know, like what's going on. Anyway, it's a bit of a tangent. I would say, you know, like let's not collapse geopolitics and racial injustice. There's a lot going on in Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is seen as an incredibly important battleground between the West broadly, NATO specifically, and Russia and its desired sphere of influence. So it's not just a whiteness question. It is also definitely a question of, you know, why some conflicts simply matter more than others because they are geopolitically significant. But of course, there's no way to think about the incredible material resources being sent to the Ukraine, either in terms of, you know, weapons and war making, or in terms of the financial supports, or in terms of just the levels of political solidarity. You know, like in Halifax, for a long time, they were flying the Ukrainian flag from the bridge as a sign of solidarity. Lots of folks with Ukraine flag on the back of their cars as bumper stickers, and like no shame on that. Okay, like I'm not going to wade into the quagmire that is the war in Ukraine right now in terms of adjudicating it, but obviously the people who pay the price in war are civilians, and like what is going on in Ukraine is awful, and what is going on for Russians who are like opposed to the war and are being caught up in it is awful too. And that's a real incredible cost of life. And if we're to believe the toll so far, upwards of 500,000 dead already, like these are mind-boggling numbers, and that's awful, and it should definitely stop, right? And our solidarity is important in that. That said, yeah, you know, like it really doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the litany of conflicts, disasters, complaints from all around the world about different things, and to see a vastly different valuation of life, right? So, I mean, just think about like, and I hate to bring this up because it's like shooting fish in a barrel, but you know, when that sub full of rich people that was going to visit the Titanic blew up, you know, because it was shittily designed and like not, you know, properly, whatever, you know the story, right? So they're all dead, all 5 of them. And that's sad, man. Their families must miss them. I'm not going to say shitty things about dead rich people blowing up underwater. But I will say that same week, literally hundreds of migrants died off the coast of Europe, right? Desperately trying to flee their awful circumstances and breach the walls of Fortress Europe to find some modicum of security. And they were left to die like at sea as coast guards and other European security forces like twiddled their thumbs and watched it happen. So yeah, let's shall we have a conversation about how like class and race impacts understandings of the value of life? And I know what the response of some folks is going to be. Well, there were brown people on that sub. Yes, there were brown people on that sub. But those brown people were part of the global 1% when it comes to wealth accumulation. So make no mistake that, you know, like race and class are very important categories. They don't always overlap, but you know, they can get you like entry to like segments of society that your skin color alone would probably bar you from. So yeah, my simple answer is, of course. My more, you know, realistic answer is, well, you know, geopolitics and racism aren't the same thing, but certainly the ability to whip up public support for Ukraine, I think, has a lot to do with notions of civilization, whiteness, and who is a noble suffering victim. And that's not to shit on the resistance of the people of the Ukraine or to side with Russia or any of that. So, you know, over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I'm glad we can revisit this because it actually speaks to some of the questions that are coming up here that also deal with refugees and settlers, but I'll answer it in turn. I guess the essence of this question is asking us about the fast tracking of Ukrainian refugees, but what about the Afghans? And that's just one example, like Alex talked about. But I think what it speaks to is a problem in Canada, not just for Canada, but for the world. I think we need to start confronting directly the fact that already for 20 years, at least, possibly longer, we've been dealing with the early effects of climate-induced migration and forced migration. This is one of the reasons why refugees in general are oftentimes living 17, 18 years of their life in refugee camps before being resettled. We need a completely different, a new overhauled system for integrating climate-induced refugees, which oftentimes manifests in the form of war and geopolitics. In the case of the Ukrainians, I don't think that that's climate influenced to any great degree. I think that's pure Russian imperial geopolitics. But in terms of what's happening with respects to migrants from South Asia and Central Asia and Africa, is that the climate is becoming unlivable. And when the climate is going to become unlivable, largely because of the things that we as the beneficiaries of modernity have taken for granted for a long time, is we will be moving millions, perhaps tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people around the world in some new shape or form. And our institutions, this nonsense about like, you know, safe third country, this and that, none of that is going to make a lick of a difference in terms of the coming climate catastrophes of the next 150 years. And the people with power at the intersection of all the various kinds of power, and in particular class in this one, have been trying to gaslight the idea that climate change is a real thing since the 1980s. And we are now being asked to allow these innovators and job creators to take the lead on dealing with these issues and creating policy options. And it's absolute nonsense. So the fact of the matter is, in our lifetimes, there's going to be massive movements of people that will need, and we will need to decide, are you going to welcome people or are you going to block them? And these are the ethical, practical, political decisions that we need to be making right now to deal with the impending refugee crisis that is going to dwarf anything that we might think of as a refugee crisis right now. And it's coming in the perceivable future. If not in your life, definitely in your children's lives. And I'm not saying this to be like a scaremonger. I think we can all see the writing on the wall here. Hopefully, even like the recalcitrant right should be able to understand this. So, you know, we need to be thinking about this. And yeah, I mean, it kind of foregrounds our next question. So I'll pass it back to you, Alex.
Definitely great points. Yes, on to the next question. Are displaced migrants like refugees also settlers? Should freedom of movement in Canada be based on the affirmation to integrate into the Indigenous systems on the territory you wish to live? So this is a great, short, but very complex and rich question. So, there isn't any specific consensus on this, like drawing on kind of scholarship and activism. Most people, though, would agree that refugees are not simply settlers, because they have been propelled into motion, right? Rather than choosing to come like a colonizer would, right? A settler colonizer would. So sometimes the term used for people like refugees is arrivants. I don't like that term. I just don't like the word. It sounds so clunky. But it's meant to distinguish between immigrants, right? Like, and people who arrived here often because they had no choice, right? They're looking for a safe place to escape from whatever horrors they are trying to escape from. I do think that, post-settlement, none of our identity categories are fixed, right? So yeah, I mean, okay, like legally speaking, I'm a Canadian citizen. That's never going to change unless I'm forced or compelled to leave this country for some reason. So that won't change. But you're not actually technically a refugee forever if you are granted status here. Then eventually, presumably, you become a permanent resident and then perhaps a citizen. Like as that process moves on, like you're not given a pass because your conditions were awful that brought you here, to not think about the reality that your very ability to be here, you're not welcomed in. Not that you wouldn't have been, you would have been, actually. Like every bit of history we know indicates that people who were suffering were welcomed by Indigenous nations here and are welcome to integrate into those societies, absolutely. But that's no longer true because hundreds of years of brutal settler colonialism have passed. Canada's a thing. Like in terms of like control of territory, that burden belongs to the Canadian state and doesn't get laid at the feet of Indigenous nations just yet, except obviously in the territory they explicitly hold sovereignty over and control. So it's, like if you're claiming citizenship, winning citizenship, achieving citizenship in the context of the Canadian state, then yeah, I think kind of like you begin to slide into settler colonialism, and you're not given some permanent pass. You have to grapple with the fact that as your precarity hopefully is alleviated, that you become something else, right? Like you become somebody who now has to grapple with the reality that your security also rides on the fact that this country was founded out of an ongoing legacy of dispossession and incredible genocidal violence. And that's just something you got to grapple with. You're not extra responsible. You're not really less responsible, but certainly refugees arriving here, I don't think should be asked to grapple with it, right? They got enough going on, right? But obviously long term, yeah, that's what we want, right? Like I think, if you're asking me what my dream scenario is, then yes, of course. Well, like I imagine a future where Canada as such doesn't exist anymore, certainly as a nation state. And we live in some kind of amazing grassroots federation of fairly autonomous communities and municipalities where we're compelled to deal with difference, figure things out, and absolutely engage with peaceful, dignified, democratic relations with the Indigenous communities and nations who exist alongside us and who some of us may live within and choose to abide by. I don't think there's any turning back the clock here. And maybe that's dismissive or controversial. I don't think we can say, okay, like we all have to live by, Indigenous traditions, right, as they're being recovered. I do think a respectful way forward for a settler would be to acknowledge the existence of those traditions, learn about them, and find a way to actually bring our political institutions into an egalitarian arrangement with them, right? So in other words, what's going on, like just to take the example of the lobster fishery out here, right, out on the East Coast. So imagine a scenario where the Canadian state or whatever, the province of Nova Scotia or DFO or whoever has to engage with Indigenous fishers without the trump card of, once again, what are we going to talk about? We're talking about agents of state repression being brought in to enforce Canada's ultimate decision-making power and rule over those resources. What if you had to actually like engage in negotiation and debate and conversation and work things out without that recourse to your Supreme Courts or to the army or to another form of violent coercion? That doesn't mean you're going to necessarily live by the traditions of Indigenous nations who hopefully are resurgent, reclaiming territory and community, all that kind of stuff. But it certainly means you're going to have to like know about them. You're going to have to engage with them. You're going to have to learn with them, and you're going to have to bring your own way of being in the world into accordance with those things. And I think that would be awesome. And I think, yes, refugees obviously would be a part of that. You know, I imagine this as a long process of doing away with all these like coercive, ideological notions that are the trappings of the modern state, and instead letting people actually like do what they probably did when settlers actually arrived here, which was before those institutions were set up, before they had enough soldiers, before they had enough guns, before there was enough disease here to really put the screws to Indigenous nations. What you had was like a pretty solid foundation of different peoples learning about one another, living alongside one another. And indeed, most of the people who were settlers coming here and weren't members of the ruling class found great affinity with Indigenous nations and often went to live with self-liberated former slaves of various colors and Indigenous peoples and maroon communities all up and down the coast of the East Coast. And like those histories are totally unknown to us because they were destroyed by the ruling class. And so I think that's a wonderful basis, like that we don't have to reach far to find that kind of commonality. So great question. Thank you for it. That's my shot at it. AJ.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so on this question, are migrants like refugees also settlers? I agree with Alex in that I don't think that it's fair or reasonable to have the same level of expectations on a refugee as you would have on a settler. But I don't think that it doesn't preclude a refugee from eventually becoming a settler, right? Because these are not like permanent forms of identification. And in that sense, you got to think about like, how are people who come to Canada, often through means not of their choosing, integrated quickly into the settler colonial national project? And that's really, I think, significant. The Ugandan, Indo-Ugandan, so settler community in its own right, political theorist Mahmoud Mandani wrote one time that one of the critical differences between a settler and a migrant is that when a migrant arrives in a place, they look around and they try to integrate into the local customs and conventions and you know, like take on that. But a settler is quite different in that they arrive and then they immediately try to recreate their point of departure. So what am I talking about here? Chinatown? Not really. Chinatown, I suppose you could argue, is an attempt to recreate some elements of a hometown, but also Chinatown emerges historically in a context of tremendous vilification of Chinese people. So it's more about carving out a safe space to be Chinese in a hostile white supremacist society. That's kind of that history. So it's not the same as the way that ethnic groups sometimes band together. It's not that they need to recreate their home, but what was really different is like, how many George Streets are there across Canada and across the various settler colonies? How many Victoria Avenues? How many, like the literal attempt, like this, our province is called in English New Scotland, you know, like Nova Scotia. The very overt attempt to recreate the point of departure is, I think, the defining characteristic of a settler. And it doesn't mean that, you know, historically that has been predominantly something that white colonizing societies have done elsewhere in the world. It doesn't in principle mean that other people couldn't do the same thing, because we're describing a mode. We're not describing like an essence or an identity. So yeah, you know, there's good literature on this as well. Border Imperialism by Harsha Walia is a really good book that picks up on some of this. There's different views on this, you know, like people like Nandita Sharma, for example, really takes the line that, you know, people of color, racialized people who are brought as a function of empire and capital should not be considered settlers. I disagree with that view, and others do too. I take the vantage point that things change, and while we should be given some slack, it then comes down to people to decide how to integrate into the local Indigenous customs. And I think that second part of your question, which is, should freedom of movement in Canada be based on the affirmation to integrate into Indigenous systems on the territories? I mean, I would say that would have been fantastic if the actual white European settlers had thought about that, when they arrived. And to Alex's point about respecting sovereignty, I think this is hugely important. In my mind, I would say that we all need to strive to integrate with that, and that sometimes means making space for the resurgence and rediscovery of Indigenous ways of being, which Indigenous activists, scholars, and elders and people have been doing this work for hundreds of years alongside the colonial state's attempt to crush that very will and intellect and practice. So get people arriving in Canada, as well as people who have been here for many generations, together share that obligation to both make space for Indigenous resurgence, and also to learn about the practices of the land that have always been here. So I would like to see that integration, and like Alex's example speaks to, the fisheries conflict here is a really important one to think about. I'm going to recommend, it's going to sound really self-serving, but I've written 3 things in the last little while that kind of speak to this problem. The first is a short, open access, very accessible book chapter simply called Sovereignty, that talks about the idea of understanding sovereignty on different kind of ontological starting points. And that's by Showing Theory to No Theory is the name of the book. And then the next one is an open source article called Pluriversal Sovereignty and the State of IR, which includes a case study specifically about the Mi'kmaq fisheries and what that has meant for rethinking what Canadian and settler colonial nationalism ought to be, if we're, albeit in a kind of academic sense. So skim it, but it's the essence is in there. Back to you, Alex.
Awesome. Thanks for the recommendations there too, Ajay. All right, on to what I suspect will be our final question of the session. And then, so AJ and I will take a run at this each, and then I will just pass it over to AJ to wrap up for the month. So in Vancouver, I often hear people make comments about Chinese immigrants creating the housing affordability crisis. Do you have any tips for how to respond to this? Such a timely question, obviously, even though this one's from a few episodes back. Housing crises continue to plague us all across this country. Indeed, all across the global north, right? We see more and more of this. And, like the short answer to that, the reason that's happening is because, like, as you probably know, housing is a commodity, an extremely lucrative one. So when we turn things into commodities, it doesn't mean we're making something awesome and precious out of it, right? Like, all a commodity is something that is available for sale on the market. So as we saw during the pandemic, for example, or during the emergency phase of the pandemic, people desperate to get out of completely shut down urban centers all of a sudden wanted, someplace with a backyard, more space to live, to go outside if they could afford it. And in the city where I live, where AJ and I live, housing prices were sent skyrocketing as a result of mostly Southern Ontarians actually looking to come out here and to get out of Toronto and elsewhere, because the Golden Horseshoe is a nightmare when you don't have the big cosmopolitan life happening, right? So in that case, obviously, like I bring that up simply to illustrate how, the process that we might call, on the one hand, gentrification, right, which is the buying up of the transformation of historically racialized and working class neighborhoods into havens for the middle and upper classes, happens in various ways, is a long process that urban geographers and others have talked about for a long time. But yeah, like these international or even transnational dynamics now are driven, as you would expect, by a capitalism that has become fully globalized. So yeah, there are rich Chinese investors undoubtedly who are investing in different housing markets all around the world. There are rich South African investors. There are Korean investors. There are certainly all kinds of North American investors of various hues and dispositions doing that too. To think about this as a racialized issue is I think it's straight up wrong, right? And often conversations around gentrification take on racialized tones, rightly so, because again, like the dividing lines in a society like ours, which is based on like original sin exclusions, right? So misogyny around, patriarchy, around race and racism, around settler status or indigenous, like all these things are like foundational around like whether you're working class or you're ruling class, all these divisions become even more sharp as the stakes become more urgent, right? Or become higher rather. And yeah, now we have international competition for more and more seemingly scarce housing as a result of Airbnb and other short-term rental practices, right? So what does this all mean? Does this mean housing is absolutely scarce or that housing is relatively scarce? Well, it means the second one, right? We haven't run out of homes. In fact, most research done in the last few years demonstrates there are actually more empty houses in the United States than there are unhoused people. So it's not a crisis of stock, it's a crisis of accessibility. And I mean, like, this is a drum we've been banging and others, obviously, in all kinds of other contexts about basically every big social issue we're talking about, whether it's, funding for schools, whether it's safe space in community, whether it's how we deal with the pandemic, whether it's, the fate and state of healthcare. All these questions come back not to a lack of resources, but a willingness to mobilize resources in certain kinds of ways. So yeah, I would say in Vancouver, because of its sort of implication in a Pacific economy in a way that obviously like the other coast isn't. Your conversations about China, about, Pacific influence are more intense, but obviously historically, Chinese and Asian immigration to that part of Canada has been also more sustained. So certain kinds of people become identified as boogie people of, the kind of the henchmen of the operation of global capitalism. Because, if you're a poor person, or if you're a person who's like an average everyday person who doesn't have, like a huge pool of capital that you're investing, that's close to home, right? You can understand some rich person from somewhere else coming in and buying up houses in your community or condos and make it impossible for you to live there. And that's an easy thing to grab onto, to feel like you can do something about and to hate on. It's a much more difficult proposition to say you live in a chronic state of insecurity because of an economic system that got going like hundreds of years ago and now is systematically benefiting people who had the ability to buy in way earlier, and basically you're shut out because you couldn't get in because of because your parents weren't wealthy, because your grandparents weren't wealthy, whatever, right? Like however far back it goes. Simon Springer, the anthropologist and anarchist, has a great article about this that talks about both the housing crisis and the run on toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic, that you can look up. I think we've referenced it elsewhere in our reading list, so check our reading list, but look up Common Dreams and Simon Springer and toilet paper, and you'll get a great little article, super readable, not academic at all, about like how capitalists create artificial scarcity in order to drive up the price of commodities. Like, so yeah, of course, people who are flipping houses want you to pay more. People who are property owners want you to pay more. People who are landlords want you to pay more rent. They like, this is how they make their money. And interestingly enough, Marx had held nobody in greater contempt than the so-called rentier class of capitalists, right? Like, contrary to popular belief, Marx, understood that like capitalism was a force of creative destruction, right? Especially posed against feudalism, that the bourgeoisie were an authentically revolutionary class transforming society. But that was only when capitalists were engaged in this hard work of bringing labor and capital together at the right place and time to do something, right? And of course, it's still exploitation. But when people are just like, yeah, I own this shit, I'm gonna make you pay all this money to live in this shit, and I'm gonna do as little as possible with this shit, while I suck all the money out of you in the community, that is not arguably the kind of capitalism that the original laissez-faire capitalists envisioned. That is actually a parasitical form of social relationship where you're sucking the wealth out of other people as you hold on to property and build nothing new, right? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Blaming Chinese people is stupid, obviously. It's like, Jews historically being blamed for the banking industry. It's a form of entrenched racism, but it's not empirically factual at all. By all means, hate on the people doing this. That is the property owning class of that are engaged in rampant property speculation and are like, everything about their existence relies on your life becoming less and less affordable. Over to you, AJ.
All right, thanks, Alex. Yeah, kind of building on the same points, I really do think financialization of housing is the issue here. I'm going to come back to that, but I first want to address the kind of Vancouver specific aspect of the question. So this idea that Chinese people are creating a housing crisis in Vancouver, I mean, the same kind of argument has been made every couple of years, going all the way back to the, probably the 19th century, late 19th century. Vancouver has a very particular anti-Asian racism problem. It's not that the rest of Canada doesn't have it, but it has like particular resonance and longstanding presence in the West Coast because of the particularities of migration and head taxes and all of these other things. In the 90s and onwards, it branched out a little bit, and what you heard a lot were the quote unquote monster homes, right? So this was the phenomena where Asian families, Chinese, Punjabi, Indian, Pakistani, what have you, would be going into undeveloped, generally undeveloped or less developed areas of peripheral cities like Surrey, like Richmond, etc., and buying up kind of like older housing, tearing it down, building brand new, very ostentatious looking, I suppose, housings. I think we've talked about this before, but it's been a long time, so I'll say it again. There's a cultural dynamic to how Asian families operate that's a little bit distinct from how, white families tend to operate in North America. We have intergenerational homes and families where we might house, like 2, 3, 4, 5, even nuclear families, what we would call nuclear families in the West, which also kind of goes to show you how like the word nuclear family actually just reflects a cultural distinction from Western Europe and North America. But that's a separate issue. How does this relate into housing? Well, it's given rise to the fact that, like, the perception that poor white people were being pushed out by Asian people. And then I think this is why in Vancouver in particular, you hear these rumblings of like, oh, it's like it's Asian people, it's Chinese people. Now, map this onto the year 2023, in the federal government's attempt to have a retreat in Charlottetown, to deal with the housing crisis, the very real housing crisis that we're in Canada. They come out and the first announcement that they make is that the problem is international students. International students are buying up too much housing. We need to crack down on universities, which they probably do need to do for reasons that have nothing to do with international students themselves. So they basically threw one of the most precarious, like hardworking and exploited groups of people directly under the bus. And rather than trying to seriously think about during this retreat the structural dimensions of the housing crisis, which is really a question of financialization, the fact that we allow something as important, centrally important to human existence as housing, to be commodified in such a way that literally, you know, like I've just pulled up some numbers here from Statistics Canada that talks about, you know, like in British Columbia alone, there's about 270,000 people who own multiple properties themselves. So this isn't even about people who are like, you know, like what, you know, in a financial commitment with another person, and they co-own. This is an individual who owns more than one home, and we're talking 270,000 people. In Nova Scotia, that same number given here is you know, almost 83,000. And you can see, so as a broader problem in Canada, the issue is that most Canadians try to save by virtue of purchasing this physical commodity, a house of some sort, and then ultimately hoping to gouge for future rents, which, as Alex explained and Mark's explained, you know, this is not productive in an economic sense. It's nothing new is being generated here. I don't necessarily blame middle-class Canadians for trying to look after themselves. I think that in a better organized society, people wouldn't be so petrified of dying in poverty in their old age that they would feel the need to purchase surplus housing, and with the hope of exploiting future people, whether they be renters, international students, or future buyers. But we have to identify what the actual structural determinants of this crisis are. And housing is not a commodity that should exist in the surplus. You know, you need a house. You don't need two, you don't need three, you certainly don't need four. And the idea that people are just going to make a living out of flipping this stuff is an example of one of the many crises of capitalism. It's not about Chinese people. So I'll leave it at that. I know we are at time. Our producer needs to go. So with that, I'll just say thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful questions, for joining us again. And yeah, looking forward to catching you next time.